I have a podcast called Rehash. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. We just concluded our 5th season, which is all about what happens when art meets the internet. Is the sun rising on a new creative era, or did it set before it even began? Go check it out. Last month, I attended a screening of Robert Altman's irreverent classic, Nashville. A loosely tethered story about 24 people operating within the country music scene in Tennessee's capital city. The film has a very unconventional narrative structure, following these characters as they flit in and out of each other's lives in the run-up to a gala concert in honor of a fictional third-party presidential candidate named Hal Philip Walker. The final sequence of the film takes place at the iconic Parthenon Monument, where the gala is being held, and culminates in the assassination of the beautiful and frail country star Barbara Jean, played by Ronnie Blakely, who has spent most of the movie in a hospital bed after suffering a nervous breakdown. The assassin, an unassuming side character named Kenny, is quickly tackled by police, as the rest of the characters, including Barbara Jean's backup Suline, stand frozen in disbelief, until another unassuming side character and one of the film's many aspiring stars, Albuquerque, picks up the mic and begins to sing a song called It Don't Worry Me to the now rapturous audience, before the camera zooms away from the action and pans up towards a steely blue sky. A week after I went to the screening, this happened.
Take a look at what happened.
Since then, I haven't stopped thinking about how Altman not only prophesized where America was headed, but also how much of his filmography has managed to embody the essence of America, regardless of what a pothead hippie the guy may have been. Robert Altman is more easily defined by his status as a filmmaker than by his filmography itself. Like, critics usually land on maverick or insider's outsider when attempting to describe him, referencing his terse relationship to Hollywood rather than the themes of his work. You can tell an Altman film from its style. He had a penchant for restless camera movements, constant zooms and tracking shots. He filmed action through doors and windows. He favored meandering plot structures and lots of mumbling. And he used musical cues from countercultural musicians and composers like Leonard Cohen, Stomu Yamashita, Gerald Busby, and Tom Pearson. His style was so distinct, in fact, that its influence is impossible to ignore among a whole number of your favorite directors. But because he covered an impossibly wide breadth of genres — Western, noir, psychological thriller, showbiz morality tale, murder mystery — there's no real way to sum up Altman's contribution to cinema in a few words. One thing that has been agreed upon, however, is that he was undeniably interested in the character of his homeland, America. Robert Altman's career soared in the 1970s, and then underwent a lot of turbulence in the decades to follow, until his death in 2006. Consistently, however, his films painted a troubling, yet empathetic, absurd, and paradoxical portrait of the United States. And in the years since Nashville, and even Altman's death, American culture has only become more absurd, more paradoxical than ever before. At this present moment, where the bedrock of America's founding values seems to be crumbling by the day, violence bursting from the cracks, the question of his country's character feels more prescient than ever. So what exactly did Altman's films have to say about America? And how does he embody the spirit of a country he so loved but refused to venerate? This is Robert Altman, America's rebel director. Robert Altman was born in Kansas City in 1925 to an upper-class Catholic family. But the Great Depression hit when he was a kid, and the Altmans soon fell into a sedentary middle-class life. As a teenager, Altman attended military school before joining the army as a pilot, and his first experience with Hollywood was in his late teens, when he and his family moved to LA to begin phase training for World War II. They stayed with his aunt, a wealthy singer with a mansion in Beverly Hills, and this is where Altman was first seduced by the Hollywood lifestyle. But first, he had a war to fight. In the war, he was a pilot with his own bomber crew. Yes, their job was to fly over Borneo and the Dutch East Indies in the Pacific Theater, and bomb them. And here is where we begin to see the contradictory aspects of Altman's character. When asked about his 46 missions in this region, he said that it never occurred to him that he was killing people, before admitting, "I don't think it would have bothered me." Later, his screenwriter Brian McCabe recalled that the one thing Altman did regret from his time at war was that if the mission was aborted mid-flight, his crew would drop the leftover bombs on farmhouses on their way back to the base. McCabe, who it's important to note had a fraught relationship with Altman, said that was something he was really sorry about. But that could have been bullshit too, because he is a spellbinder, the rarest of storytellers. Altman's apparent feelings, or lack thereof, towards the brutality he played an active role in, although I'm resistant to calling it indifference because this detachedness could very well be a trauma response, stands in marked contrast to the film that would later put him on the map, and to his staunch opposition towards the Vietnam War and the war in Iraq half a century later. After the war, Altman married his first wife and returned to California, where he pursued various entry points into show business. But aside from co-writing a script for the 1948 film Bodyguard, he found little success breaking into Hollywood, which was in a state of post-war disarray. So the Altman family returned to Kansas City, and Robert got a job creating instructional films for the Calvin Company, where he cultivated an interest in directing and womanizing. Here, in the midst of a failing first marriage and waning relationship with his young daughter Christine, to whom he was a bit of an absentee father, he made his first two features. There was The Delinquents in 1957, which is a soapy drama about rebellious teens that jumped onto the wave of rebel without a cause, but lacked any of its charm, and really the edge of Altman's later work. And then there was a documentary called The James Dean Story that same year. The Delinquents was purchased by the studio United Artists and provided Altman enough money to move back to California. But since neither film led to any further opportunities, he turned to television for the next decade, in tandem with his contemporaries Sam Peckinpah, Arthur Penn, and Sidney Lumet, vets of the New Hollywood movement who also got their start on the silver screen. During his time as a television director, an era which failed to produce anything he personally wished to boast about, Altman already started to display the rebelliousness that would come to define his career in film, getting fired time and time again for his unorthodox approach to sound, plot, and direction. Writing in the intro to a companion book about Robert Altman, Adrian Danks argues that while Altman generally dismissed his background in television, this experience in the hyper-industrialized, explicitly commercial, and streamlined world of television and corporate filmmaking provided a central impetus to and influence upon his approach to genre, narrative, and technical and technological innovation throughout his career, and his reliance on formulas that allow for variation, innovation, and increasingly willful digression. Altman continued to butt heads with the industry, and his next film, a convoluted psychological thriller called Cold Day in the Park, which would later go on to influence his more introspective, Bergman-esque films like Images and Three Women, was a critical and commercial flop. It was not until Altman was middle-aged, with a string of commercial failures and broken bridges under his belt, that he would finally find success. In the late 60s, he belonged to a growing class of Americans who dissented the war in Vietnam, and it was in this climate that he would make MASH, a 1970 war romp starring an ensemble cast that included Donald Sutherland and Altman's future longtime collaborator and my personal celebrity crush, Elliot Gould. Thanks to Altman's unorthodox filming methods, which I'll elaborate on in this video, MASH is unlike any other film of its time. Based on a book by Richard Hooker about the author's experience as a medical surgeon in the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, or MASH, during the Korean War, MASH is an episodic account of a medical team working near the front lines of the war, led by three surgeons, Hawkeye, Duke, and Trapper. The surgeons are drafted into the war and thus operate as vessels for the anti-war sentiments of the people back home, with much of the film focusing on their rebellious antics. Altman enraged people on set with his filming methods, but he really cemented that idea of trust the process, because MASH went on to be a massive hit. Roger Ebert pointed out that Altman was integral to the success of the film. I had an opportunity to read the original script, and I found it uninteresting. It would have been a failure if it had been directed like most comedies. But Ring Lardner Jr. wrote it, I suspect, for exactly the approach Robert Altman used in his direction. And so the angle of a glance or the timing of a pause is funnier than any number of conventional gag lines. John Mahoney for The Hollywood Reporter called it the finest American comedy since Some Like It Hot, the Mr. Roberts of the Korean War, The Graduate of 1970, and also the film that had been expected from Robert Altman for some short time. MASH went on to be the third highest grossing film that year, making $81 million against its $3 million budget, won the Grand Prix at Cannes, and received 5 Oscar nominations. It also spawned an 11-season TV show, which Altman hated. But needless to say, MASH more than put him on the map. From this, he was able to start his own production studio, Lionsgate, through which he could have the freedom to fund many of his own films. MASH also establishes the style that Altman would become known for. On top of the heavy zoom and mumbly dialogue, Danks outlines 2 major elements of Altman's filmmaking that were very much on display in MASH. One, a panoramic form, meaning a large ensemble aesthetic where you get multiple interwoven plot lines and a digressive narrative structure, and 2, a revisionist approach to classical Hollywood genres. While MASH does show early signs of Altman's spotty record when it comes to representing women, many of the women in this movie are treated as objects or accessories to the male characters and are often sexually humiliated. It also presents its own alternative to the brute masculinity so often displayed in war films at the time. It opens with a song called Suicide is Painless, written by Altman's son Michael, which evokes the tongue-in-cheek, satirical tone that'll play throughout the rest of the film. And this iconoclastic approach towards classical tropes would become a staple of Altman's filmography to come, for better or for worse. As MASH made clear, Altman was extremely averse to being told what to do. The mark of many a male auteur. After being discharged from the military and moving back home, he describes himself as an ass, wanting to be liked so much that I would agree with whoever I was talking to, really dishonest about myself, very anti-authority. His time in television, or his frequent falling outs with screenwriters, should tell us all we need to know about how Altman felt about working under people. He did not like to be constrained, and this is evident in the way he approached genre, too. Take McCabe and Mrs. Miller, for instance, a 1971 film starring Warren Beatty as a mysterious man who shows up in a developing Washington town called Presbyterian Church, named for its only standing structure. Hoping to settle here, McCabe establishes a brothel with the help of an English madam named Mrs. Miller, played by Julie Christie, believing correctly that the sex trade is what'll help his town to flourish. McCabe and Mrs. Miller has all the components of a Western. It takes place in the frontier land of the Pacific Northwest. It's got a town that's more or less lawless. People are killed here without so much as a blink. It's got tribalism among purveyors of industry. McCabe drunkenly highballs a crooked businessman looking to buy the brothel, and finds himself amidst a life-or-death battle over the very thing that gives he and Mrs. Miller security and purpose. These are all the components of a traditional Western, only whenever the film is about to reach a generic benchmark, Altman renders it impotent. The town is by definition a Western town, but it looks nothing like the arid, sun-soaked, nostalgic towns of the Westerns we're used to. It's cold and drab and damp, likely closer to what life was actually like for settlers on the northern frontier, combating their harsh environments. As opposed to the ominous, sometimes epic music of a typical Western, Altman chose to soundtrack his film with songs from Leonard Cohen's first album. We're introduced to McCabe with a Stranger song, repeating the phrase, "He was just some Joseph looking for a manger," as McCabe climbs towards the town on his horse, a biblical allusion to a man in search of something, to martyrdom. In one of McCabe's most vulnerable moments, we hear an instrumental version of Suzanne that casts a gentle light on the previously gruff, elusive character. The songs imbue the film with a haunted feeling, too folksy and introspective for such a traditionally masculine genre. And then, in any great Western, we usually have a climactic showdown between the good guy and the bad guys, some sort of duel. McCabe and Mrs. Miller does end with a showdown, but it's more like this scene in MASH than it is like John Wayne whipping his gun from his holster and pointing it at us. The showdown plays like a drawn-out cat-and-mouse game, with McCabe cowardly skirting around the town as his pursuers prowl about, killing them off one by ambushing them or impishly tricking them. There's no machismo here. Scholar Paul Arthur argues that there is no noble motive behind McCabe returning to the town and standing down the gunman, but that he's only compelled to do so because that's what the protagonist of a Western must do. McCabe doesn't exactly die for glory, didn't die to protect anyone, could have attempted to flee to another town in the night, but this is his generic oath. It's a subtle commentary on an outdated Hollywood genre that recasts American history in a noble light. McCabe and Mrs. Miller is subtle, however, because Altman still made a Western that can be enjoyed as such. As Arthur concludes, it isn't that the familiar lineup of characters, situations, settings, and themes is suppressed or distorted, it is simply presented from unfamiliar angles, stripped of its romanticized, dualistic luster. Some critics hated what Altman had done with the Western. Vincent Canby found the movie to be self-serious, and its use of symbolism to be meddlesome. Rex Reed for the Daily News was much harsher. He said that McCabe and Mrs. Miller was one of the worst movies ever made, that people he watched it with in the theater were booing and hissing, and ended his review with the bold statement, "Altman is a master of obscenity and vulgarity, whose sole purpose as a director seems to be to shock, humiliate, and assault his audience. In McCabe and Mrs. Miller, he has thrown a pail of rotten swill at everyone in the theater, and they're throwing it right back at him." But these guys were in the minority. The film was generally lauded for its atmospheric approach, focusing less on the story and more on its structure. This is now seen as a hallmark of Altman's work, that the form of his work, the technical elements, and the genre in which they're encased are just as, if not more important, than their contents. The Long Goodbye, another one of Altman's films from that decade, was met with a similar mix of outrage and awe. The Long Goodbye is a 1973 noir film based on the Raymond Chandler book of the same name, and it follows the iconic, hard-boiled Philip Marlowe character, played by Elliot Gould, who is confronted with a mysterious murder involving his best friend. But this time around, Marlowe is, let's say, soft-boiled. Typically, noir protagonists are shrewd, cynical, aspirational, and really competent men who take control of the action around them, however little they understand it. Gould's Marlowe is characteristically mumbling, lanky, unkempt, and less so controlling of the action than it just kind of, happens to him. Altman brings in comedic elements that you'd never usually find in a noir. He repeats the theme song The Long Goodbye over and over and over again throughout the film. It's actually the only extra diegetic song played, and every single time it appears in a different musical genre. He also includes a scene where all of our villains take their clothes off for no real reason. The film also features explicit violence, with Marlowe doing little to stop it, and even at the end, perpetrating it. Altman is again taking a well-worn, outdated American genre and asking us to question it. He calls this Marlowe Rip Van Winkle, a man who sleeps for 20 years and wakes up at the start of the film in an America he doesn't recognize, one that is violent and scary and morally unclear, not unlike a classic noir, except this is a country he's completely alien to, rather than wary of. Again, some critics and even audiences did not take well to what Altman had done to the noir, and The Long Goodbye performed poorly. Yet it and McCabe and Mrs. Miller were both redeemed in the decades to follow, and preserved by the National Film Registry as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Altman's refusal to bend to the conventions of beloved industry forms, genres that contribute to the country's myth-making, did not exactly win him favor during his time. But his anti-authorial approach to genre tapped into something that only the future could appreciate. As has been well established, Altman did what Altman wanted to do. Raised by a gambling father, he was a hedonist in the truest sense, driven by impulse when it came to drinking, when it came to women, and when it came to movie making, which made him, in many ways, a difficult person to collaborate with. Since Altman was much more interested in on-the-spot decision-making, he didn't see much value in the art of screenwriting, which is one that requires a great deal of planning. This, of course, led to a lot of conflict with his screenwriters. He once told Brian McKay, "Remember this, I take all the credit and most of the money when you work with me." In this way, he was not unlike many male auteurs, Kubrick, Hitchcock, but in many ways, he was. As one interviewer observed about Altman, he admires Ingmar Bergman, who has avoided the traps by totally isolating himself. For Altman, who surrounds himself from the moment he gets up to the moment he's poured into bed, Bergman's way is admirable, but impossible. Altman was a people person, and while he was resistant to sharing a leadership position, he wasn't necessarily a control freak in the way we might expect from an auteur. Filming an Altman movie was experiential, because being on set was where most of Altman's creative process would take place. Even as early as The Delinquents, he had made the set a microcosm of the movie itself, grabbing real footage of his actors at a house party and putting it in the film. And this gives his films an air of authenticity. Of course, sometimes this doesn't quite work. For example, there's Popeye. I watched Popeye religiously as a child, and it wasn't until rewatching it as an adult that I realized this movie is a fever dream. The movie is pretty bizarre, which we'll get into, and it's also pretty jarring. And once you hear about how disastrous the production was, you understand why. Altman built an entire village in Malta that his cast and crew could also live in, which cost an exorbitant amount of money. And because they ran into so many problems during filming, like having to re-record most of Robin Williams' dialogue in ADR, having the actors sing the music live on set Les Mis style, and myriad issues with the practical effects, all of this drove the production way over budget, and the studio told Altman he had to wrap everything up regardless of if he was finished. This is why the final scene where Popeye haphazardly saves Olive Oyl and their adopted baby Sweet Pea from a giant octopus seems to take up the entire third act. However costly and bizarre Altman's methods were, though, Popeye has this kooky, idiosyncratic charm that I think will only become more apparent as the film ages. When we consider the state of CGI-laden children's movies now, we can appreciate how audacious Altman's vision really was. I've always preferred filmmakers to be bold and fail than to play it safe. And sometimes his methods made for an actually joyful on-set experience, and a more realized final product. For McCabe and Mrs. Miller, for example, he also built an entire town, on location in BC this time, plying the cast with vodka and living all together as if they were really on the frontier. As the town developed throughout the film, so it did in real life, until by the end it had cabins, a brothel, a bathhouse, a barbershop, 2 saloons, and a sawmill. They also filmed it sequentially, which is rare for a movie shoot, and it was a lucky choice because the shoot ended with a major snowstorm. Instead of halting it due to bad weather, Altman decided to push through and film the last scenes in the snow, which adds a really desolate and hopeless effect to the ending that you just couldn't recreate.
Bob, I think, took a perverse pleasure in putting me into that role, knowing how uncomfortable it would make me to play that kind of a guy. He knew exactly what he was doing, and what you see in the film, the end result is this actor who doesn't like the character he's playing. Well, what the audience get, a guy who doesn't like himself. So smart.
For Nashville, he encouraged his cast of 24 leads to write their own dialogue, play around with characterization, and draw from their own lives as much as possible. He also cast actors who were unscripted and had them on set for much of the shoot so that everyone could get a feel of community, like they were really in the world of the film.
He's an actor's director. 99% of all actors love Robert Altman. He talks to you and you feel like you're really creating your own role.
Improvisation is a tough skill to hone, and something that doesn't come easily to every actor. So Altman frequently worked with the same rotating cast of actors, like a company of sorts, who were able to consistently deliver for him. Actors like Gould, Lily Tomlin, David Arkin, Renee Auberjonois, Keith Carradine, Sally Kellerman, and most notably the late, beautiful Princess of Lank, Shelley Duvall. Of course, Altman was still preferential to being at the top, and so while many of his actors were instrumental in writing large chunks of their own dialogue, like he did with the screenwriters, Altman would take all the credit. Izzy from Be Kind Rewind has released a video this month about Shelley Duvall and her storied, complicated experience as Robert Altman's muse. It's a companion video to this one, which goes much more in depth with the Altman films that Shelley Duvall starred in. Think of it as required viewing. Credit or not, Altman was generally well-liked among his actors, cultivating a rich environment where creativity could really flourish. As Altman himself put it, "I never have really watched anybody else direct a film, so I can just surmise what they do. I have no idea. I find more and more that the less I do, the better the work comes out. So now my function is really to try and stay out of the way, and make the conditions and circumstances as conducive as I can for the actors to do what they do." I actually like to think of him as the anti-Kubrick. Collaborative, improvisational, filming as few takes as possible, and entirely unconcerned with perfection.
I have an interesting relationship with this movie. All right, because I think the first reel of the movie is the worst mixed reel in the history of Hollywood cinema.
Okay,
it's so badly. There's a level of incompetence to the mix that Hollywood never really goes below. He's a pothead who doesn't know any better. He thinks it sounds good.
Yeah.
A lot of people think that Warren Beatty actually was kind of the co-director on that movie. I asked Warren Beatty about that once, and he goes, "Well, you don't think that pothead could have got that performance out of Julie Christie, do you?"
Despite what Tarantino says about the quality of the first 20 minutes of McCabe's sound mixing, I think the film's roughness contributes greatly to its realism. This leaving things up to chance often makes for some really beautiful filmmaking. Films like Nashville, MASH, Three Women, and his later ensemble piece Shortcuts all have this very lived-in, organic, spontaneous feel to them. Like anything could just occur at any given moment, and you wouldn't know if this was by design, or if it just happened to have dropped onto set from the sky and left in the final cut. Altman's interviewer says it better than I could. Making his films more real is close to the core of Altman's work as a director. He wants to catch the accidents of life and fling them on the screen hard enough to knock the breath out of the audience. He wants to weigh the screen down with vulgarity, pleasure, pain, ugliness, and unexpected beauty. He wants magically to change 2 dimensions into 3. And that's certainly true. To sit down for the 1, 2, 3 hours it takes to watch one of his films can be a very transportive experience.
It's very easy to look at Nashville and read it as your kind of State of the Nation address at that time, isn't it?
Yeah.
Was that must have been part of your intention?
Something occurs to me, and I think, oh, that's good, and then the things that relate to it, where it relates politically or culturally or to the audience that I'm eventually going to show it to, I heighten that up because I'm aware of that. But I don't carry any big causes on banners through these films.
Altman's films have been described as satirical, and you can definitely see that in the way he bends genre, but this doesn't come across as clearly in the themes of his films. It's hard to find even his most satirical films particularly scathing of their subject matter, especially when you compare them to the controversial, nihilistic filmography of his contemporary Sam Peckinpah. One critic noted that next to The Wild Bunch, McCabe and Mrs. Miller seemed soft and warm. This goes for The Player as well, one of his more overtly satirical films. This 1992 thriller stars Tim Robbins as a smarmy studio executive named Griffin Mill, who murders a failed screenwriter he suspects of sending him threatening postcards.
The Graduate, Part 2.
From the jump, it opens with Griffin sitting in his office and hearing pitch after pitch of the most insipid movie ideas you've ever heard, all of which seem to be directly lifted from another film and starring either Julia Roberts or Bruce Willis or both. The Player has an open disdain for writers.
Blackness. A mangy dog barks. Garbage can lids are lifted as derelicts in the streets hunt for food.
Portraying them as aggressive, pretentious assholes in oversized tweed blazers. It also has a deep disdain for the rattiness of Hollywood execs.
I'll be there right after my AA meeting.
Oh, Larry, I didn't realize you had a drinking problem.
I don't really, but that's where all the deals are being made these days.
It provides racial commentary, making a very timely reference to the beating of Rodney King.
This is Pasadena. We do not arrest the wrong person. That's LA. See, LA, they kick your ass and then they arrest you.
And it provides another extremely relevant commentary about the industry's habit of prioritizing commercial interests over art and America's penchant for false optimism, inserting tacked-on happy endings and big-name stars on every film, no matter the material. Throughout the film, Griffin is pursued by another screenwriter hoping to pitch a script that ends with a woman being put to death, the anti-Hollywood ending. But instead, we end The Player with the shooting of this fully realized film. And Julia Roberts plays the woman being taken into the execution chamber, only to be saved at the very last minute by Bruce Willis, her final line being,
Took you so long.
Traffic was a bitch.
And then, with a wink and a nod, The Player itself concludes with Griffin having gotten away with murder and returning home to June, the now pregnant girlfriend of his victim, saying,
What took you so long?
Traffic was a bitch.
From the most perfunctory glance at this movie, you can tell it's not a serious thriller. We can see the wink. But in spite of that, and in spite of Altman's decades-long conflict with Hollywood studios, Griffin is a sympathetic character. He's a smarmy womanizer and literal murderer, but you feel bad for him. As he's thrust from situation to situation, being relentlessly pursued from all directions, never given a moment of rest, you feel his exhaustion. In the final act, June asks him about his job, and he's given the opportunity for nuance.
Collectively, we hear about 50,000 stories a year. So it's hard. I guess sometimes I'm not nice and make enemies.
So even in his most searing satire, Altman takes a strangely empathetic approach to his most reviled enemy, refuses to be too scathing. The Player should have been controversial in Hollywood, but everyone loved it. Even Altman, in a VHS commentary of the film, said it was a mild satire that offended no one.
I think that people say this is a satire and it's an attack on Hollywood. It isn't. It's I'm using Hollywood and the film business as a metaphor for culture in the country.
Saying what? A metaphor for what?
Talking about greed and who we admire. We teach our children to admire people who make money, and it doesn't make any difference how they make it.
You're also saying, I'm a part of this system, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely.
You're saying this is me as well.
Absolutely. There's not one, I can't do a satire about anything unless I'm at the core of it, because otherwise it's propaganda.
Ultimately, I don't think Altman ever really hated Hollywood. He describes his early years in California as an era of star-f***ing, being seduced by the glitz and glamour and the girls of it all. And when you think about it, The Player is a critique of an industry that, through this film, Altman was happy to be welcomed back into after a decade-long hiatus. His films are almost too empathetic to be true satire. It's been an ongoing back and forth among scholars of Altman as to whether or not his films are condescending about America, but I don't think so. What struck me about Nashville in particular, perhaps the most controversial of the bunch, is that the film makes American culture look absolutely unhinged, but it never opts to look down on it, rather staring at it head-on. Many Nashvillians were offended by the film's depiction of their city, but scholar Helen Kieser defends it. The problem is not that Altman reduces individuals or the American to predictable images and behaviors, but rather that we as audience are so ready to assume our knowledge of these people that we resist discrepancy and interpret eccentricity as condescension. The characters are idiosyncratic and bizarre, but never descend into unflattering hillbilly stereotypes, rather offered to us frankly, panoramically, and pretty tamely in the scope of satires of the American South. Altman told another interviewer, "With everything I do, there's a question. Is this the way it really is? Do the bad guys have to be real bad? Do the good guys have to be real good? I don't believe so. I don't think it's all cut that easily. It's of no interest to me to be a teacher or a moralist or a propagandist." And I think the way he achieves this is through some very intentional techniques, ones that have set him out from the rest.
Well, it was in an article, wasn't it? You said about nobody has ever really made a good movie.
No, what I said was that I feel that the medium of film has not yet really been explored. In other words, I think that when we started a film, we took it from theater, literature, and we were an extension of another art form. And it's still that way. It's getting away from it. And I think that eventually somebody will make a film that is purely a film, and the audience can respond to as such.
Something that can be really frustrating about Altman's films, or really incredible if you're willing to buy in, is his use of overlapping dialogue.
You know what I mean by that.
In any scene with more than one character, sometimes tens or even hundreds, he opts to prioritize multiple mics at once. So, as his actors are delivering their lines, you'll get one person saying one thing, another person talking at the same time as them as they are saying something else, and someone even louder coming in over top. Here, he's decentralizing our focus and allowing us to pick someone different to listen to at each time. This can really add to the longevity of his films, since you can't possibly listen to every voice at the same time, making each viewing experience a slightly different one. The same goes for visuals.
I think it's like a painting, an experience. It's got, the only limitations are the linear ones. It has length, it has its beginning and an end, it takes a certain amount of time. But I think that ideally the audience can look at a film, emotionally get the whole thing, and not necessarily be able to explain it to somebody else. They say, hey, how'd you like the picture? I liked it.
When you compare him to a filmmaker like Bergman, who relies on close-ups to pull the eye towards the interiority of a character, Altman is preferential towards wide shots. The closest he gets to a traditional use of close-up would be in those psychological, surrealist dramas like Images and Three Women, but for the most part, his frames have a wide, shallow depth of focus, and he shoves as much as he can into that image, an image so excessive it could really only be American. Scholars have likened him to the painter Renoir, although I'd say his work is less delicate than Renoir's, and closer to that painting that hangs across from the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, The Wedding at Cana, which is stuffed full of so much action that you can't possibly take it in all in one viewing. Maybe that's why everyone opts to stare at the Mona Lisa. Kieser calls Altman's style a kind of visual promiscuity, arguing that promiscuity is a refusal of commitment to any one person or image. It makes intimacy difficult, but not impossible. What she means by that is that these techniques, overlapping dialogue, wide shots, maximalism, filming through windows, achieve a distancing effect between the viewer and what they're seeing on screen, giving them the option to choose to be intimate with one subject at a time. This promiscuous style can be really overwhelming if it's placed on the wrong subject. Like, what's immediately off-putting about Popeye, for example, is that it's a live-action retelling of an iconic children's comic book character told through the eyes of a director known for his incomprehensible dialogue, attention-deficit camera, and maximalist art direction. The power of comic book characters is in their simplicity, repeated catchphrases, isolated visuals, and simple punchlines. But when this is mixed together with Altman's style, it makes for something a little odd. Robin Williams and Shelley Duvall are a masterclass of physical comedy here, but Williams' already mumbling characterization of Popeye is constantly drowned out in the layered dialogue of other, louder characters.
Just why I'm here is I'm looking for me pep. Yeah.
And Shelley as Olive Oil is directed to repeat the same phrase over and over and over again while other characters are speaking, so it ends up becoming a little bit annoying pretty quickly, and can take away from the action of a given scene. The art direction in this movie is amazing and so spectacular, but because it's mixed with Altman's kind of realism-y camera work, it places a bit of a confusing atmosphere upon the film. But with his less earnest, more satirical films, the style is perfect. This is why we can't exactly pin down a singular stance or scathing critique in his films, however satirical they may be. He wants you to make a decision about his subjects. This makes him the perfect director to capture the soul of America. As Kieser writes, the power in Altman's films is not in melting diversity in the pot of American culture, but in the interanimation of authentically conflicting voices. What is the American sensibility? This is a question at the forefront of Altman's filmography, though he never falls into the trap of giving us a clear answer. Altman opens his bold but convoluted comedy Brewster McCloud with the American national anthem. The film, which follows a guy named Brewster who lives in the Houston Astrodome and spends his time building a contraption that he hopes one day will help him fly, has some great vignettes, but is overall a jumbled mess. But if I could extract one clear theme from the film, it's that Brewster's innocent dream of flying is constantly being corrupted by the greed around him. Quite American. The Player and The Long Goodbye are both critical of Hollywood, whether that's The Long Goodbye's unflattering portrayal of the hypocritical, languid ethos of South California hippie types and the amoral world in which they live, or The Player's entire approach to the American studio system. McCabe and Mrs. Miller exposes the open greed upon which the country was built, and the myth of manifest destiny.
Do you think they want their stockholders thinking that their management isn't imbued with all the principles of fair play and justice? The very values that make this country what it is today?
That capital cannot be raised honestly, but instead through cheating, gambling, and the exploitation of women.
White men, they're different. Well, the only time they dream is when things are going their way.
Buffalo Bill and the Indians, or Sitting Bull's history lesson, also a revisionist Western, is an even more overt critique of American mythology. Taking Buffalo Bill, one of America's most iconic figures, and casting him as a bumbling, incompetent, pompous idiot.
Why is it so dark in here? Hey, son! Get down!
Who rigs his own Wild West show to rewrite a history where the white settlers are the heroes and indigenous people are villains. The film makes abundantly clear that, in fact, the opposite was true.
So, Sitting Bull's the little fella, huh? He don't look so savage to me.
It uses Buffalo Bill's Wild West as a meta-commentary on the way American legend has been fabricated by the Hollywood myth-making machine.
You wanted to show the truth to the people. Why can't you accept that just once?
Because I got a better sense of history than that.
I was beginning to think you didn't exist. But here you are in the glorious flesh. And what a sight for sore eyes. Buffalo Bill. The thrill of my life to have invented you.
MASH is rife with references to American pop culture, and is distinctly American in the way it approaches the war, happily distracted and largely undisturbed by a conflict happening just a mile away, one that's never seen or heard. Across the board, Altman's films seem to tap into the peculiarities of American culture. Excessive, money-obsessed, brainwashed, mediatized, desperately lonely, and undeniably full of life. But no film of his embodies these qualities quite as well as Nashville. Nashville came to be when United Artists, who themselves owned a music company, wanted to make a movie about the country western scene, and approached Altman to direct it. At first he was hesitant, but after reading a book called Ruby Red about a fading country music star, and learning from a friend that this idea was implausible because, quote, country stars don't fade, he enlisted screenwriter Joan Tewksbury, who he had worked with on Thieves Like Us, to write a screenplay, weaving in her own experiences with visiting Nashville over the years. Recently, Tim Walz gave an interview in which he spoke about where Americans believe the true spirit of their country really comes from.
When George W. Bush was winning in 2004, right, Democrats were losing the heartland, right? You know, if you're in California, you're not in the heartland. There's this sense of, particularly the Midwest, as that's where people are normal. Then they get sort of weirder on the coast. They get
real
different
America.
In the South, real America.
Altman, himself from the heartland, seemed to know this when he chose Tennessee as the subject of his film. The Nashville he and Tewksbury paint for us is overflowing with life and full of contradictions. Bustling, chaotic, nostalgic, brazenly artificial, deeply religious, loud, remote. United Artists was so wary about Altman's plans to have the actors write their own songs, and his stubborn commitment to having the film end in murder, that they, his agent George Lito, and art director Polly Platt backed out. Luckily, the ABC company stepped in to produce the movie for $3 million, so long as their own record company could market the film's soundtrack. That's a lot of faith in your actors. Thankfully, it was a good risk to take. Nashville brought something completely unprecedented to the world of film. A decentralized, winding cinematic experience, with Altman's roaming camera placing a documentary-esque lens onto a cacophony of characters colliding into each other. Among them, there's a white gospel singer and mother of 2 deaf sons, Linnea, played by Lily Tomlin, who catches the eye of Tom Frank, the member of an incestuous Fleetwood Mac-style folk rock group. There's a batty BBC radio correspondent who weaves in and out of the story, chasing stars and frequently making politically incorrect remarks. There are the country stars, like the pompous Haven Hamilton and virginal Barbara Jean, and under them a slew of hopefuls, like Sulene and Albuquerque. There's Hal Philip Walker, candidate for the replacement party, who we never actually see in the film, but his lawyer Delbert and advance man John serve as his surrogates, and our own, providing an outsider's point of view to the chaos of the city. Then there are smaller characters who, for the most part, are played for laughs, like Kenny, a mysterious visitor turned assassin, or Shelley Duvall's character Martha, a bohemian from LA who's constantly changing her appearance, and is in Nashville to visit her dying aunt, but is instead cavorting with almost every male character.
Hi.
Neither Kenny nor Martha have many lines. And then some characters, like Jeff Goldblum's Tricycle Man, never speak at all. The film has an absurd tone to it. The characters are almost obnoxiously optimistic. This is evidence from the beginning, when everyone gets into a major car crash on the way back from greeting Walker at the airport, and all simply sit there in their cars, continuing their conversations as if nothing happened. Their upbeat nature is evocative of that famous Southern charm and hospitality. But I say obnoxious because the optimism comes across a little put on. No one in this movie seems to be connecting with one another, rather bulldozing along in their own worlds and kind of looking out for themselves. The BBC correspondent rattles on to anyone who will listen to her, never picking the appropriate audience. Linnea's husband talks at his deaf sons without using sign language, never really caring if they can hear him or not. Martha doesn't seem to care much about any of the people she sleeps with and is more interested in how they'll make her appear, and neither does Tom, who sleeps with a number of the women in the movie. One of the most famous scenes is where Keith Carradine, who plays Tom, sings a self-written song called I'm Easy, where he repeats the phrase I'm easy before an audience of current lovers, all of whom think the song is about them, until they realize it's actually about Linnea. This would be romantic, except all the while he's openly revealing that he has no true ties to anyone. When he and Linnea finally consummate, we get this hilarious exchange where, after Linnea tells him she has to leave, he immediately calls another one of his women before she's even fully dressed and out the door.
Listen, can you come down here?
Where?
Tonight?
Barbara Jean herself is a figure who represents how lonesome it is at the top, clearly in no condition to continue her career, but surrounded by people like her pushy husband-manager who do not have her best interest at heart. Ultimately, Nashville really captures the hyper-individualistic roots of the country, which has this every man for himself ideology firmly embedded within it. The film is about this community, a scene, yet no one seems to really know or care about one another. When we see all of the performers on stage together at the gala, and all the adjacent people standing in the crowd to watch, they all feel like they belong to different movies. As scholar Chris Durham argues, Nashville's alienated community becomes a metaphor for the wider national population, alienated and dislocated, split apart by ideological fragmentation, and fundamentally disenchanted with America. And all of this social dislocation and distractedness is the perfect environment for a populist movement to grow, which is where Hal Philip Walker comes in. John clearly thinks of the people of Nashville as a backwards people, espousing all the stereotypes that people from the heartland seem to think about the coastal elites, like Walls spoke about. He minces no words that Walker is running his campaign on populist ideals. He'll change his tune depending on the popular sentiments of the working people in a cynical attempt to convince everyone that he's one of them, when in reality he isn't. Which is what makes it so bizarre that the character Altman chooses to kill off at the end of the film is not Walker, whose presence we've been anticipating for the entire film, and whose assassination is continuously foreshadowed.
Only time I ever went hog wild around the bend was for the Kennedy boys.
Altman himself said about the ending that everyone assumed it would be the political candidate who was assassinated, because that's something we can accept, we buy that. But he shot the entertainer, and we don't know why. But we do. In the Nashville of this film, the true so-called heroes are the country and western singers, who've developed a cult of worship around them and who serve as symbols for the health of the city. It's like the high school footballers in the Texas town of Friday Night Lights, or Buffalo Bill in his Wild West show. In American society, it's not politicians, but folk heroes like these who truly have influence. And the killing of Barbara Jean, and not Hal Philip Walker, is a very prophetic commentary on America's problem with idol worship, one that I'm not even sure Altman knew the importance of. 5 years after Nashville came out, John Lennon was shot down on his doorstep. Later in 1989 came the killing of television actress Rebecca Schaeffer, and the attempted killing of Bjork half a decade after that. All bursts of spontaneous, senseless violence against folk heroes. When Barbara Jean is shot, Haven Hamilton, who's been a generally self-absorbed character for the duration of the film, selflessly throws himself over her body in an attempt to protect her. He then cries out,
"This isn't Dallas, it's Nashville."
And as Durham remarks about this moment, when Haven Hamilton defiantly states this is Nashville rather than Dallas, an unfortunate and traumatic reality is laid bare. This is indeed Nashville, but it is very much also the United States of America. In such a heavily mediatized society, the line between celebrity and politician begins to blur. Celebrities are gunned down as if they were political figures, and political figures cultivate giddy fandoms as if they were celebrities. And so really, the movie in many ways predicts the phenomenon of Donald Trump, a person who embodies the dangerous merging of these two identities, a cynical populist like Hal Philip Walker, trained in the art of celebrity and idol worship like Barbara Jean, whose rise to power signals the potential end of American democracy as we know it. Like I said, Nashville was a risk that paid off. For all its kooky, unconventional approaches to storytelling, the film came at a good time, one not so different from the time we're in today. America was finally coming out of the 2-decade-long disastrous war in Vietnam and still recovering from the shock of Watergate, both events that had shaken public trust in the government. As the bicentennial, the country's 200th anniversary celebration, approached, patriotism was at an all-time low. And out of the already challenging wave of films coming out during this new Hollywood era, Nashville's very literal snapshot of a country on the brink, just patching itself together enough to keep moving, was exactly what Americans wanted. I think this quote by Kieser sums it up best. We learn from the work of Robert Altman that we can only rightly ask how individual Americans include in their consciousness of self the knowledge of racism, of the corruption of the American dream, of extraordinary violence, and yet remain Americans. Nashville answers this with a steady dose of insanity. While the film didn't make the biggest returns at the box office, it received 5 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. It was looking like Altman's career would finally reach an equilibrium. In his book, Robert Altman, Hollywood Survivor, Daniel O'Brien writes, halfway through the most productive phase of his career, Altman had come tantalizingly close to re-establishing himself as a commercial director. In the event, Nashville attracted enough acclaim to place Altman in good standing with the big studios. His career was still in good health. The operative word here being close, but not close enough. With the success of Nashville, one would think Altman was finally establishing himself as a commercial director again. But while the 1970s are largely regarded as the heyday of Altman's career, it was not without its own string of flops, starting with Brewster McCloud. Even after Nashville, other films in the 70s like Buffalo Bill and the Indians, Quintet, and A Perfect Wedding weren't the successes Altman hoped they would be. But none of these flops were enough to knock him down. And then he came out with Popeye in 1980. Although Popeye has been redeemed in the decades since and was quite a hit with young children, it was considered such a monumental nightmare by the studio, and Altman too risky in challenging a director, that he was blacklisted in Hollywood. He sold Lionsgate and retreated into making smaller-scale films based on well-known plays, later moving to Paris, where he mostly worked in television for the remainder of the decade, not having another critical hit until The Player in 1992, and then again with Shortcuts in the following year. But again, there's something that feels oddly frantic and vulnerable about Popeye, which, even if you dislike the movie, is hard to ignore. And I think this speaks to Altman's larger filmography. Popeye belies this voracious work ethic, a sort of hunger on the part of Altman that kept him working all those years, despite his failures.
You know, these films are like children to me, and you tend to love your least successful children the most. But they are complete, they are what they are, and I like them all of them.
Yeah, indeed.
And
yeah,
so it's to me, it's all the same thing. I've always felt my life's always been in one straight line, and everybody else is kind of crisscrossing me occasionally.
Altman's wartime crew used to tell this story about how Altman had to abandon his plane in the sea on the way back from a mission to New Guinea. They said that he was well on his way back to shore, safely away from the plane, when he remembered a pack of cigarettes that he had left on the sinking aircraft, and swam all the way back to go get them. His biographer McGilligan writes that what his crew remembered about this moment was that he was someone who managed to have a good time and look out for himself no matter what the peril. He was a bit of a survivor in a way. As Danks observes, the wonder of Altman's career and his resilient reputation was his ability to keep producing work no matter the critical and commercial response to his earlier or immediately prior creations. Also remarkable were the seemingly endless array of producers, financiers, studios of various sizes and configurations, and collaborators who wanted to work with him despite the general lack of commercial success that met the overwhelming majority of his 37 feature films. In a way, I think Altman is a lot like some of his most famous protagonists. Characters like Gould Marlowe or McCabe aren't really heroes, and we shouldn't treat them as such. Altman wasn't interested in mythology like that anyway. Rather, they're like wily survivors, with occasional strokes of genius or prowess, stumbling as they go but pushing on through the very end. One scholar, Robert Kolker, even saw parallels between Altman and his fictionalized version of Richard Nixon in the one-room drama Secret Honor. I would not suggest that Altman, of all people, identifies with Richard Nixon, but rather that the final outcry of that paranoid figure created by Altman carries enfolded within its hysteria some of the very calm, non-paranoid defiance expressed in Altman's own work and career. Altman earns his title of maverick filmmaker because he was able to make one critical and commercial flop after another for basically the entirety of his career, yet the conviction of his style, method, and audacity kept him more or less afloat as a highly respected director until his death in 2006. O'Brien ends his book with a quote that I think is fitting for this video too. "The only ending I know of is death." At the end of Nashville, when Albuquerque picks up the mic and begins to sing It Don't Worry Me, a song as aptly titled as Suicide is Painless at the beginning of MASH, the people in the crowd begin to dance and sing along, completely unbothered by the violence they just witnessed, the killing of their beloved folk hero. Why? Because another one emerged as quickly as Barbara Jean had left, so what is there to be worried about, really? It don't worry me. And I think this mantra is very befitting of a person like Altman. He was the perfect American director, full of paradoxes. Authoritarian but collaborative and anti-authorial, ambitious but an outsider, excessive but introspective, empathetic but satirical and misogynistic, violent but pacifistic, grumpy but bullheadedly optimistic. It's just as easy to love Altman as it is to hate him. He could be a terror, but he was also capable of producing some of the most empathetic and authentic art his country has to offer. And what better way to represent America? As a Canadian, it's a country that can be infuriating to live next to. One that constantly befuddles the international community. But it's also one I'm trying to move to. and that I can't help but being enamored by at times in spite of myself. And that's Altman.
Let me be the one to understand you. It's awful. Let me be the one to lend a hand.
Robert Altman was known for pushing boundaries with his filmmaking. But there are other filmmakers who take those boundaries and just throw them right out the window. My series Taboo on Screen is about these filmmakers, people who take the concept of subversive to a whole other level, showing us the ugly, morally gray, and taboo aspects of humanity, and in doing so, attempt to crack open our worldviews, successfully or not. You can find Taboo on Screen exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that's creator-founded and creator-led, which means we get a ton of creative control over the videos we make. Right now, you can see Taboo on Screen, as well as all my past videos, ad-free on Nebula, and you can even watch Nebula videos offline with their app. In Taboo on Screen, we look at films that challenge and sometimes offend our sensibilities, covering difficult topics like whether we should get rid of sex scenes, the films of Todd Solondz, Brooke Shields and the controversy around Pretty Baby, and the wacky world of John Waters. Taboo on Screen is just one of a whole host of prestige original series on Nebula, made by some of your favorite creators. We're taking the art of video making to a whole other level, and providing a range of thoughtful content. You can think of Nebula like Netflix for people who love cultural commentary, and an impossibly wide range of other fascinating subjects as well. If you like my videos and you like Taboo on Screen, then you'll definitely love Unrated, a Nebula original series by Maggie Mae Fish, where she dives into the history of sex and sexuality on the big screen. You can also find Be Kind Rewind on Nebula, and many of my other favorite creators like Princess Weeks and Thomas Flight. If you're interested in watching some really amazing original content, you can sign up using the link below, and you can support me directly and get Nebula for a 40% off annual plans. Then there's lifetime memberships, which cost $300 and last you forever. No tricks, no gimmicks, just you, me, and eternity, baby. Go do it, you won't regret it. So go to nebula.tv/BroeDeChanel or click the link in the description for 40% off right now. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Malpertui, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C, Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M, The Wiz Daniel, Edward Yu, Andrew Nguyen, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Ryan Blythe, Maya Kamaeva, Naomi Nakagawa, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Alexis, Mathis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Friedjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.